The chill of the ballroom had nothing to do with the November air seeping through the tall windows. It lived in the glances that slid away from her, in the whispers that curled like smoke behind painted fans, and in the empty space beside her where her husband should have stood. Elena, Duchess of Ashworth, pressed her gloved fingers against the stem of her champagne glass and willed her heart to slow. The crystal was cold as the vast marble floor beneath her slippers, and she focused on that small sensation because it was the only thing that felt real. The rest, the glittering chandeliers, the swirl of silk gowns, the distant echo of the string quartet, was a dream from which she could not wake. She had worn the emerald green gown because she wanted to please him. She had pinned her dark hair with the sapphire combs his mother had given her, the heirlooms meant to signify her place in this family, and she had stepped into the ballroom believing that perhaps tonight, at the annual Ashworth Winter Assembly, things might be different. He had looked at her once, a flicker of acknowledgement across the grand hall, and then his gaze had passed over her as if she were part of the wallpaper, a painted figure in a gilded frame, noticed and forgotten in the same instant. She watched him now, standing near the hearth, his dark head inclined toward Lady Margaret Winslow, a widow with hair the color of spun gold and a laugh that carried across the room like a peal of bells. Alexander, the Duke of Ashworth, was a man carved from stone. Handsome, yes, with a jaw that could cut glass and eyes the grey of a winter sea, but cold, always cold. He stood with his broad shoulders relaxed, one hand resting casually on the mantel, and he smiled at Lady Margaret in a way he had never smiled at his own wife. Elena felt the sting of it, sharp and immediate, a wound that opened and bled without a drop of blood. "Did you see the Duchess's gown?" The whisper came from behind her, a young debutante who had not yet learned the art of discretion. "Emerald does not suit her. She looks positively washed out." "Duke clearly thinks so," another voice murmured. "He has not spared her a glance all evening. Such a shame. They say she trapped him into the marriage, you know. The family needed an heir, and she was convenient." Elena's fingers tightened on the glass. Trapped him. The word was a lash. The truth was far simpler and far more devastating. She had loved him. She had loved him with the desperate, consuming love of a girl who had seen a lonely boy beneath the title and believed her warmth could thaw his frost. She had entered this marriage with hope like a candle flame, and over 4 long years, the cold of Ashworth Hall had snuffed it out until only a wisp of smoke remained. She set down the champagne glass before her trembling hand could betray her. The quartet struck up a waltz, and she watched Alexander lead Lady Margaret onto the floor. His hand settled at the widow's waist, and they moved together with an easy grace that made Elena's throat close. She could not breathe. The room was too bright, the noise too loud, the loneliness too vast. She turned, her silk skirts whispering against the marble, and walked toward the terrace doors. No one stopped her. No one noticed. She was a ghost in a house full of living people, and the emptiness was a weight she carried every waking hour. Outside, the winter air struck her face like a blessing. The terrace was empty, the stone balustrade slick with a thin layer of frost. Beyond it, the gardens of Ashworth Hall stretched into darkness, the hedgerows and rose beds sleeping under the moon. Elena leaned against the cold stone and let the tears come. They fell silently, hot against her chilled cheeks, and she made no sound. She had learned to cry without noise, as she had learned to walk without being heard, to smile without feeling, to exist without being seen. She was the Duchess of Ashworth, and she was the loneliest woman in all of England. The carriage ride home was a study in silence. Alexander sat across from her, his profile sharp against the velvet squabs, and he stared out the window as if the darkened countryside held more interest than the woman he had vowed to cherish. Elena clasped her hands in her lap and studied the stitching on her gloves. She knew every thread, every tiny imperfection, because she had examined them 1,000 times during 1,000 similar silences. When they reached the great doors of Ashworth Hall, he did not offer his arm. He never did. He strode ahead, his boots echoing on the black and white marble, and disappeared into his study without a word. The heavy door closed with a finality that rang through the cavernous entryway. Elena stood alone beneath the massive chandelier, its candles long extinguished, and listened to the silence of the house. It was a living thing, that silence. It seeped into the walls, into the heavy draperies, into the very air she breathed. It was the silence of a marriage that had died before it had ever truly begun. The days that followed were a blur of grey winter light and empty rooms. Elena rose each morning in her separate chamber, a beautiful room of pale blue silk and mahogany that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. She took her breakfast alone on a small table by the window, watching the frost-etched delicate patterns on the glass. She walked through the gardens, her boots leaving solitary prints in the snow, and she spoke to no one except the servants, who answered with polite formality and nothing more. Alexander was often absent, locked away in his study or riding out to inspect the estate. When their paths crossed, he offered clipped nods, perfunctory inquiries about her health, and nothing that resembled warmth. He was a stranger she shared a name with, and the weight of that truth pressed on her chest until she thought she might shatter. One afternoon, in a fit of restless despair, she wandered into the east wing, a part of the hall that had been closed off for decades. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight slanting through the shuttered windows. She pushed open a creaking door and found a forgotten room at the end of a long corridor. It was an old studio, abandoned by some long-dead relative, with easels draped in yellowed cloths and cabinets full of brittle brushes and dried pigments. The air smelled of turpentine and aged wood, and something in Elena's heart stirred. Memory, faint and distant, of herself as a girl, before marriage, before duty, before the crushing loneliness. She had loved to paint. Her father had called it a frivolous pursuit unworthy of a lady, and she had packed away her brushes the day she accepted Alexander's proposal. But here, in this forgotten place, the longing returned with a force that stole her breath. She returned the next day and the next. She cleaned the room herself, refusing the help of servants. Scrubbing the grimy windows until the light poured in like liquid gold, she found old canvases, stretched and primed, and mixed what pigments she could salvage. Her first painting was a simple thing, a single winter rose she had plucked from the frozen garden, its petals edged with frost. She poured her loneliness into every brushstroke, every subtle shade of white and cream and palest pink. When she finished, she sat back and looked at it, and for the first time in 4 years, she felt something other than pain. She felt a flicker of purpose. The studio became her refuge. While Alexander retreated to his ledgers and his tenants and his distant, cold world, Elena retreated to the east wing and painted. She painted the gardens in all their seasons, the village children playing by the stream, the old oak tree on the hill that had stood for 300 years. She painted the sky at dawn, when the light was soft and full of promise, and she painted the sky at dusk, when the shadows grew long and the world seemed to hold its breath. And in secret, in the quietest hours of the night when the house was utterly still, she painted him, Alexander. She painted the line of his jaw, the curve of his mouth that never smiled for her, the storm gray of his eyes that had once, in a fleeting moment during their engagement, held something that resembled tenderness. She painted the man she had believed him to be, the man she still, against all reason, ached for him to become. The paintings were her escape, her silent rebellion, her voice. Through them, she could express all the love and longing she could no longer speak aloud. She signed each canvas with a small, delicate emblem, a tiny wren, a bird too plain to be noticed, too small to be seen. It was her secret identity, the one place where she was not the invisible Duchess, but a woman with a soul that bled color and light. Months passed, and spring arrived with a riot of green and the scent of rain-soaked earth. The village of Ashworth began to stir from its winter slumber, and talk turned to the annual charity fete, a tradition that raised funds for the local orphanage and the widow's fund. As Duchess, Elena was expected to preside over the event, to smile and nod and make polite conversation while the real work was done by others. She had always done so, a painted porcelain doll on a satin cushion. But this year, a wild, reckless idea took root in her heart. What if she contributed something that was truly her own? What if, for one afternoon, she let the world see the woman behind the title? She selected 5 of her finest landscapes, the ones that captured the soul of Ashworth, the rolling hills and the quiet streams and the light that fell like a benediction on the ancient stones. She had them framed simply and delivered them to the village hall the morning of the fete, with a card that read "Only by the hand of E. Wren." She arranged them in a small alcove, away from the main bustle, and she told no one. Not even her maid, not even Alexander. The day of the fete dawned bright and golden, the kind of spring day that made the heart ache with its beauty. Elena wore a simple gown of lavender muslin, her only adornment a single strand of pearls, and she moved through the crowds with a practiced smile. Alexander was there, of course, standing with the local magistrate, his presence commanding as always. He glanced at her once, a brief flicker of acknowledgement, and then returned to his conversation. The familiar sting was there, but Elena found that it had dulled. Somewhere in the months of quiet creation, she had begun to build a wall around her heart, a wall made of canvas and pigment and hope. It was the village vicar who discovered the paintings. He had wandered away from the tea tent in search of a quiet corner and stumbled upon the alcove. His exclamation of wonder drew others. Soon, a crowd had gathered around the 5 small landscapes, their voices rising in astonishment and delight. "Who painted these?" a woman asked, her hand pressed to her chest. "I have never seen such light. It is as if I am standing on the hill myself." Ren, the vicar read from the card, adjusting his spectacles. "I do not know the name. A traveling artist, perhaps." Elena stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart thundering in her chest. Her cheeks were flushed, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. She had not expected this. She had hoped, perhaps, that someone might glance at them and offer a polite word, but this outpouring of genuine emotion was overwhelming. She felt as though she was standing on a precipice, the wind tugging at her skirts, and she did not know whether to step back or to leap. And then she saw him. Alexander had drifted over, drawn by the commotion. He stood at the back of the crowd, his height giving him a clear view of the paintings. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his grey eyes. He studied each canvas in turn, his gaze slow and deliberate, and Elena watched him with a breath held so long it burned in her lungs. He lingered longest on the painting of the old oak tree, the one she had painted at twilight, with a single figure standing beneath it, small and solitary. It was the figure of a woman, her face turned away, her posture one of patient waiting. It was, though no one else would know it, a self-portrait of her own loneliness. The vicar, ever eager to solve a mystery, began to question those nearby. Had anyone seen the artist? Did anyone know the name? It was a young village girl, one of Elena's favorite models for her sketches, who pointed a trembling finger at the Duchess. "It is her Grace," the girl whispered, her eyes wide. "I saw her painting in the East Wing. She gave me a ribbon once, and I saw the canvas." Silence fell. The crowd turned as one, a sea of astonished faces. Elena stood frozen, her secret laid bare, and she felt a terror so profound that she thought she might faint. But then something remarkable happened. The vicar's face broke into a beaming smile. "Your Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have given us a gift beyond measure. These paintings are the very soul of Ashworth. You have captured the heart of this place." The crowd erupted into applause. Ladies pressed forward to clasp her hands. Gentlemen bowed with a new depth of respect. The village women, who had always viewed the Duchess as a distant figure of cold aristocracy, looked at her with tears in their eyes. Elena stood in the center of it all, dazed and trembling, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. She looked across the crowd and found Alexander's gaze. He was staring at her with an expression she could not name. It was not the cold indifference she had grown accustomed to, nor was it the fleeting approval she had once craved. It was something deeper, something searching, as though he was seeing a stranger where his wife had always stood. But he did not approach her. He did not speak. He simply looked at her for a long, suspended moment, and then he turned and walked away, his broad back disappearing into the crowd. That night, Elena sat alone in her studio, the moonlight spilling through the clean windows and pooling on the floor like liquid silver. The triumph of the day had faded, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. She had revealed her heart to the world, and the world had embraced it. But the one person whose recognition she had desperately, secretly hoped for had said nothing. He had walked away, and in that silence, something inside her finally shifted. The candle flame of hope, the one she had guarded for 4 long years, guttered and went out. She would not seek his approval anymore. She would not twist herself into shapes to fit the cold, empty space he had carved for her. She would build a life of her own, a life filled with color and purpose and the warmth she had been denied. She would paint, and she would teach, and she would find joy in the world beyond the frost-bound walls of Ashworth Hall. If he did not want her, then she would learn not to want him. It was a resolution born of pain, but it was also a resolution born of strength. For the first time, she felt not like a ghost, but like a woman awakening from a long, cold sleep. The weeks that followed marked a transformation. Elena opened a small studio in the village, a bright, cheerful room above the bakery where the scent of fresh bread drifted up through the floorboards. She began teaching painting to the village children, and then to their mothers, and soon even to some of the local gentlemen who wished to learn the art of capturing a landscape. She laughed more in those weeks than she had in years. The village embraced her not as a duchess, but as a friend, a teacher, a woman with paint-stained fingers and a gentle smile. She stopped waiting in the hallway for Alexander to emerge from his study. She stopped dressing for dinners he rarely attended. She filled her days with purpose, and her nights with the quiet satisfaction of exhaustion honestly earned. The great house felt less oppressive now because she spent so little time in it. She was building a world outside its cold stone walls, a world where she was known and valued and loved. It was in this world that she met Mr. Julian Thorne. He was a landscape architect, brought to Ashworth by Alexander to redesign the neglected formal gardens. He was a man of perhaps 35, with kind hazel eyes and a gentle manner, and he possessed a deep, reverent appreciation for beauty. He first saw Elena's paintings at the village studio, and he stood before them in silence for a full 5 minutes before he turned to her with an expression of genuine awe. "You paint the light as if you are in love with it," he said, and his voice was soft, unassuming. "I have never seen such tenderness in a landscape. You make the ordinary sacred." Elena felt a blush rise to her cheeks. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with such simple, unadorned respect. Julian did not flatter, he observed. He asked about her techniques, her inspirations, her love for the Ashworth countryside. Their conversations became a regular occurrence. He would find her in the garden, sketchbook in hand, and they would walk together, talking of art and nature and the quiet beauty of the English countryside. He never presumed, never overstepped. He treated her as an equal, a fellow artist, and his friendship became a balm to her wounded spirit. Alexander began to notice. He saw them walking together along the rose terrace, their heads bent in conversation, Julian's hand gesturing toward the distant hills. He saw Elena's smile, the genuine, unguarded smile that she had not directed at him in years, and something dark and unfamiliar twisted in his chest. At first, he dismissed it as irritation. Thorne was an employee, and Elena was a duchess, but the feeling persisted, growing sharper with each passing day. He found himself watching her. He noticed the way the sunlight caught the copper threads in her dark hair, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed, the graceful curve of her neck when she bent over canvas. He noticed, with a pang of something that felt like pain, that she no longer looked at him at all. One evening, he came upon her in the corridor, returning late from the village. Her cheeks were flushed from the evening air, and she carried a small canvas wrapped in cloth. She stopped when she saw him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. He searched her face for some trace of the longing that had once been there, the desperate, silent plea for his attention. It was gone. In its place was a calm reserve, a polite distance that cut him more deeply than any anger could have. "You were with Thorne," he said, and the words came out harsher than he intended. He did not know why he said it. He did not know how to stop. She said simply, "He was helping me choose a location for my next landscape. The light over the eastern meadow is extraordinary at dusk." She did not apologize. She did not explain further. She simply met his gaze with a steady, quiet strength that left him utterly disarmed. He wanted to say something. He wanted to bridge the chasm that had yawned between them for so long, but the words would not come. He had been raised to suppress emotion, to view vulnerability as weakness. His own father had been a cold, distant figure, and his mother had retreated into a world of bitter silence. He had never learned the language of the heart, so he said nothing, and Elena, after a moment's pause, inclined her head and continued down the corridor, leaving him standing alone in the gathering shadows. That night, driven by a compulsion he did not understand, Alexander did something he had never done before. He climbed the stairs to the east wing and entered her studio. The room was bathed in moonlight, the canvases stacked against the walls like silent witnesses. He lit a lamp and began to look. He saw the landscapes she had painted, the ones he had glimpsed at the Fayette, but there were others too, portraits. And then he found the one that stopped his heart. It was a painting of himself, but not the man he saw in the mirror. This was a man with warmth in his eyes, a man whose stern mouth curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, a man capable of tenderness and love. It was a man he did not recognize, a man he had never allowed himself to be. And yet, Elena had painted him. She had seen this ghost of a possibility, buried beneath years of coldness and duty, and she had loved it enough to bring it to life on canvas. He stared at the painting for a long time, and something inside him began to crack. The ice that had encased his heart for so many years was splintering, and beneath it, he felt a rush of pain so intense that he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. He had been blind. He had been cruel, not with overt malice, but with the slow, grinding cruelty of indifference. He had taken a woman who had offered him her whole heart, and he had left her to freeze in the shadows of his own self-absorption. And now, she was slipping away. She was building a life without him, a life filled with light and color and the admiration of others, and he was watching it happen with the sickening certainty that he had no right to stop her. The jealousy that had been simmering in his blood now sharpened into a blade of pure regret. He saw Julian Thorne's kind eyes, his easy smile, the respectful way he spoke to Elena, and he knew that he, Alexander, had never once offered her such simple decency. He had given her a title, a cold house, and a loneliness so profound that she had been forced to find solace in a forgotten attic room. He had been a fool, and the realization was a wound that bled without ceasing. The confrontation came on a stormy evening in late autumn. Elena had returned from the village, soaked and shivering, to find Alexander waiting in the great hall. His face was pale, his grey eyes dark with an emotion she could not read. He stepped toward her and she flinched, a tiny, instinctive movement that made him stop in his tracks. "Elena," he said, and his voice was hoarse, unfamiliar. "We need to talk." She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and regarded him with that calm, distant gaze he had come to dread. "If it is about the village studio, I assure you I am not neglecting my duties. The household runs smoothly. This is not about the household." He took a breath, and the words tumbled out clumsy and raw. "I saw the painting, the one of me." Her composure flickered. A shadow of pain crossed her face, there and then gone. "You were not meant to see that. Not because it shows a man who does not exist." He stepped closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "You painted me as I could have been, as I should have been, and I looked at it and I saw nothing of myself. I saw only the man you deserved, and I realized I have never been that man, not once, not for a single day of our marriage." Silence that followed was thick with years of unspoken agony. Elena's eyes glistened, but she did not weep. She was beyond weeping. "You never saw me," she whispered, and her voice was steady, though it trembled at the edges. "I stood beside you for 4 years, Alexander. I smiled when you ignored me. I spoke and you did not listen. I reached for you and you were not there. I poured my love into this house, into our life, and you let it run through your fingers like water. You gave me nothing but silence. Do you know what that silence did to me? It hollowed me out. It made me feel like I was nothing, like I did not exist." Each word was a lash, and he took them all, his head bowed, his shoulders stooped. He had faced down political rivals and hostile tenants, but nothing had ever undone him like the quiet, devastating truth in his wife's voice. "I am sorry," he said, and the words were so inadequate, so pathetically small against the weight of her pain. "I am so sorry, Elena. I was raised to believe that emotion was weakness. My father was a block of ice, and my mother retreated into bitterness. I never learned how to love. I did not know how to be a husband. I thought providing for you, giving you the title, the estate was enough. I did not understand that I was starving you of the only thing that mattered." "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "Your heart," he said, and his voice broke. "You gave me your heart, and I treated it as if it were nothing. But it was not nothing, it was everything. I was just too blind, too afraid to see it. And now I see you with Thorn, and I see the life you are building without me, and it is killing me. Not because I am jealous of him, though God help me I am, but because I am only now realizing what I have lost, what I threw away." Stood very still, the storm raging beyond the windows, the rain lashing against the glass like 1,000 tiny fists. She felt the familiar ache in her chest, the yearning that had been her constant companion for so long, but there was something else there now too, a fragile, tentative thing that felt like the first stirrings of hope. "You cannot undo 4 years of silence with one apology," she said, and her voice was gentle but firm. "You broke something in me, Alexander. I do not know if it can be mended." "I will spend the rest of my life trying," he said, and his grey eyes, those cold winter-sea eyes, were bright with unshed tears. "I will learn, I will change, I will be the man you painted if you will give me the chance. Not because I deserve it, I know I do not, but because I love you. I have always loved you. I was just too much of a coward to admit it, even to myself." The word love hung in the air between them, fragile and shimmering, and Elena felt the wall around her heart tremble. She did not fall into his arms, she did not offer absolution, but she did not walk away either. She simply looked at him, this man she had married, this stranger who was suddenly, achingly familiar, and she nodded. "Then prove it," she said, "not with words, with time, with patience. Prove to me that the silence is truly broken." He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and took her hand. His touch was warm, hesitant, as if he were handling something infinitely precious. "I will," he said. "I swear it on everything I am." The months that followed were a slow, careful dance of healing. Alexander did not push. He did not demand. He simply began to show up. He appeared at her village studio one afternoon, a tray of tea and biscuits in his hands, and asked if he might watch her paint. He sat in the corner, silent but present, and when she glanced at him, he offered a small, tentative smile that made her heart stutter. He began to join her for dinner, not in the grand, echoing dining room, but in a small parlor where a fire crackled and the walls were hung with her paintings. He asked her about her day, about her art, about the children she taught, and he listened. For the first time, he truly listened. He told her about his childhood, The cold, cavernous rooms of his own upbringing, the father who had never embraced him, the mother who had withered into a shell. He spoke of his fear, his crippling fear of vulnerability, and how he had buried it beneath layers of duty and reserve. It was not an excuse, he said, it was simply the truth, and he offered it to her like an offering at an altar. She received it with the same quiet grace she had shown through all the years of neglect, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ice between them began to thaw. The true test came with an invitation from London. A renowned gallery had heard of the Duchess artist of Ashworth and wished to host a solo exhibition of her work. It was an honor that would place her among the most celebrated painters of the day, and Julian Thorne, ever supportive, had been instrumental in arranging the introduction. Elena was exhilarated and terrified in equal measure, and she turned to Alexander with a question in her eyes. "Will you come?" she asked, and there was a vulnerability in her voice that he had not heard in years. He took her hands, his thumbs brushing over her knuckles, and said, "I would not miss it for the world." The night of the exhibition was a triumph. The gallery blazed with candlelight, the walls lined with her paintings, the landscapes of Ashworth, the portraits of village folk, the quiet, luminous works that spoke of longing and hope and the beauty of the ordinary. The cream of London society filled the rooms, their voices hushed with awe. Elena moved among them, radiant in a gown of deep sapphire, her dark hair piled softly on her head, and she answered their questions with a humble grace that charmed everyone she met. Julian stood near the doorway, his smile one of quiet pride, but his eyes never lingered with anything more than friendship. He had always known her heart belonged elsewhere, even when she herself had doubted it, and Alexander stood at the back of the room, watching his wife shine. The jealousy that had once burned in him was gone, replaced by a profound, aching pride. This was the woman he had nearly lost. This was the woman he had ignored, dismissed, abandoned to loneliness. And yet here she stood, a testament to resilience, to the power of a spirit that refused to be extinguished. He felt tears prick at his eyes, and he did not wipe them away. When the last guest had departed and the gallery was quiet, he approached her. She stood before her favorite painting, the one of the old oak tree at twilight, the solitary figure waiting beneath it. He came to stand beside her, and for a long moment they simply looked at the canvas together. "I was so alone," she murmured, her voice distant, as if speaking to the painted woman. "I stood there for so long, waiting for someone to come. I did not know if anyone ever would." He turned to her, his heart pounding, and said, "I am here now, Elena. I know it is late. I know I have wasted years. But I am here, and I will never leave you alone again. You are the light of my life. You always have been. I was just too lost in the darkness to see it." She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of the woman in the painting, the woman who had waited and hoped and finally found her way home. "The silence is broken," she whispered. "I can hear you." Reached for her then, and she came into his arms as naturally as if she had always belonged there. He held her close. His cheek pressed to her hair, and he felt her tears soak through the fine wool of his coat. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of healing, of a love that had endured the coldest winter and had emerged, at last, into the warmth of spring. They returned to Ashworth Hall in the quiet hours before dawn. The great house, once so forbidding, seemed to welcome them with a gentle stillness. They walked together through the garden, the first pale light of morning touching the rose beds, and Alexander stopped beneath the old oak tree on the hill, the very one she had painted so many times. He turned to her, his grey eyes soft and full of a tenderness that had been locked away for too long. "Elena," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion, "I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you know you are seen, you are heard, you are loved. Not as a duchess, not as an artist, but as the woman who brought my frozen heart back to life." She smiled, a smile that reached her eyes and lit them with a radiance that rivaled the rising sun. "Then let us paint a new beginning," she said, together, cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle, and he kissed her. It was not the hesitant, duty-bound kiss of a stranger, but the deep, reverent kiss of a man who had finally learned to love. And beneath the ancient oak, with the dawn breaking golden over the hills of Ashworth, the Duke and Duchess began again. The silence was gone. In its place was a melody, soft and enduring, the music of two hearts finally beating as one.